The rain had been falling over Harwick City since before dawn. It fell in cold, indifferent curtains against the leaded windows of St. Augustine Academy, streaking the glass like the tears of something ancient and weary. Inside, the academy smelled of polished mahogany, old money, and the particular kind of silence that only institutions built to exclude people could cultivate. A silence that said, "You do not belong here," as clearly as any locked door. Alara Thorne had heard that silence every single day for 2 years. She sat now on a wooden chair outside Principal Archibald Sterling's office, her small feet not quite reaching the floor. She was 8 years old, but she looked younger, the kind of thin that comes not from youth, but from too many dinners that were really just half a portion, from winters in an apartment where the heating cut out in November and stayed out until March. Her sweater was enormous on her, faded cornflower blue, the sleeves rolled up 4 times to free her hands. It had been her father's once. She wore it every day because it still smelled, very faintly, like him, or at least she told herself it did. She was no longer certain whether the smell was real or something she had invented to keep herself from drowning. Her shoes were worse. They were the shoes of a child whose guardian was working 3 jobs and still coming up short. A pair of white sneakers that had long since given up being white, the left sole peeling away from the upper and reattached with a strip of silver duct tape that caught the light when she walked. The other children at St. Augustine noticed. They always noticed. Today, they had noticed too late. A boy named Preston Whitmore, 11 years old, 40 pounds heavier, possessed of a father who sat on the school's board of trustees, had been pressing a smaller boy named Daniel against the lockers for the better part of morning recess, grinding Daniel's carefully completed history project into the marble floor with the heel of his blazer shoe. Daniel was crying silently, the way children cry when they have learned that crying loudly only makes things worse. Alara had watched for approximately 4 seconds before she walked over and stepped between them. She didn't shout. She didn't threaten. She picked up the crumpled pages of Daniel's project, smoothed them against her knee with her small, reddened hands, and said to Preston, in a voice that was entirely too calm for an 8-year-old, "You should go now." Preston had gone, but not before shoving Alara hard enough that she hit the row of lockers with a sound that echoed down the corridor. And then, with the particular genius of the privileged for self-preservation, he had gone directly to the administration office and reported that Alara Thorne had attacked him unprovoked, which was how she had come to be sitting in this chair, her shoulder aching, her jaw set in a line that was pure Clara, a stubbornness inherited not by blood but by necessity. The doors to the principal's office opened. "Get in here," said Archibald Sterling. Principal Sterling's office was a monument to a certain kind of man. The walls were paneled in dark walnut. His desk was the size of a small aircraft carrier, behind which he sat like a general surveying territory he had never actually fought for. There were framed photographs of him shaking hands with donors, with politicians, with the kind of people who appeared in the society pages of the Harwick City Gazette. There was not a single photograph of a child. Alara walked in and stood before the desk. She did not fidget. She had learned very early that fidgeting looked guilty, and she was not guilty. Sterling looked at her the way a man looks at a stain on an expensive tablecloth, with a particular mixture of disgust and inconvenience. "Alara Thorne," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded like an accusation. He picked up a test paper from his desk and turned it over. It was her mathematics exam from the previous week, returned now with a perfect score, 100%, Mr. Braddock's neat red handwriting in the corner. Exceptional work. Truly exceptional. Sterling's lip curled at it. He dropped it. Then, with a deliberateness that was entirely theatrical, he let it fall off the edge of the desk and crumple at her feet. Alara looked at it. She did not pick it up yet. "Do you know how much it costs per year to attend this academy?" Sterling began, leaning back in his leather chair with the satisfaction of a man about to deliver a speech he had rehearsed. $42,000 per year. The families of this school, the real families of this school, pay that without blinking. They support this institution. They fund its laboratories, its arts programs, its reputation. He paused. And then there are the scholarship students. He said the word the way other people said infestation. Your father's name was on a 20-year-old endowment fund that some well-meaning idiot set up in 1994. That fund paid for your place here. And I have been patient, Alara. I have been enormously patient. But patience has limits. He stood, pressing his palms flat against the desk, leaning forward so that his face was closer to hers, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath. "Look at your shoes," he said softly. "Look at them." Alara looked at her shoes. The duct tape caught the light from his expensive desk lamp. "Your sister is a diner waitress who can't pay the heating bill. I've had parents complain to me. Complain, do you understand? That their children came home asking why the scholarship girl comes to school dressed like she's been through a rubbish bin. You are an embarrassment. You are a stain on this institution." He reached into his desk drawer and produced a document. "I have the power to nullify your scholarship on the grounds of conduct unbecoming." Preston Whitmore witnessed by 3 of his friends. "He was hurting Daniel," Alara said. Her voice was very quiet. "Daniel's project was about his grandmother who died last year. It took him a week. I don't care about Daniel's. My sister says that being poor isn't a crime." The words came out of her with a steadiness that had no business being in the body of an 8-year-old. "She says that. Every morning when I'm scared to come here, she says it." Alara's dark eyes were bright, not with tears, not yet, but with something brighter and harder than tears. "Being poor isn't a crime, but being cruel is." The silence that followed was extraordinary. Sterling stared at her. For a single, flickering moment, something moved across his face that might, in a different man, have been shame. Then it calcified back into contempt. He picked up the document. "Pack your things, Alara. I'm calling your sister too." The doors opened. Not knocked. Not announced by his secretary. Opened, both of them, at once, pushed inward with the quiet authority of a man who has never needed to knock on a door in his life, because every door he has ever approached has always, eventually, opened for him. Julian Vance stepped into the office. He was tall. Not in the way of men who are simply tall, but in the way of men who take up more space than their physical dimensions account for, who carry with them a gravitational field of presence that reorganizes the room around them. He wore a charcoal suit that had clearly been made by someone who charged more per hour than Sterling paid his teachers in a week. His hair was dark, slightly damp from the rain, and his face was the face of a man who had been extraordinarily handsome before life had carved a few harder lines into it. A jaw like a decision, eyes like the North Atlantic in February, gray, deep, and absolutely without warmth. Behind him, hovering at a respectful distance, was his assistant, a young man in a navy suit clutching a leather portfolio and emanating the particular anxiety of someone who had learned, through experience, exactly how quickly things could go wrong in Mr. Vance's proximity. Sterling's face did something complicated. The color drained from it, leaving behind the waxy pallor of a man who has just remembered something terrible. "Mr. Vance, I wasn't expecting, the tour isn't scheduled until I moved it." Julian's voice was low, unhurried, dangerous in the way that very still water over a very long drop is dangerous, not because it is loud, but because of what lies beneath it. He had stopped just inside the door. His gray eyes moved from Sterling to the child standing alone before the desk, then to the crumpled test paper on the floor at her feet. He took one step forward and picked it up. He turned it over in his hands. "Read the score. Read the teacher's note." His expression did not change. He set the paper down on Sterling's desk with a precision that was almost ceremonial. "This is yours," he said to Alara. Then he looked at Sterling. "Your academy, Archibald." It wasn't a question. There was the faintest trace of something. Not quite amusement, because amusement implied warmth, in the way he shaped the words. "That's funny. I bought the deed to this school 20 minutes ago, which means it isn't your academy anymore." He reached into his jacket and produced a document of his own, a single folded page that his assistant had ready before the words were finished. "This is your termination, effective immediately, pending full audit of the school's financial records, which, given what my accountants have already found in the preliminary review, I expect will be making its way to a federal prosecutor within the week." Sterling made a sound that was not quite a word. "The first piece of garbage I am throwing out," Julian continued, the same low, steady tone, as if he were discussing a quarterly earnings report, "is you. Security will escort you to your car. Do not take anything from this office except your coat." Sterling opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. He looked like a fish removed very suddenly from water, processing a new and fatal reality. Julian turned away from him as if he no longer existed, which, for all practical purposes, he didn't. He looked at Alara. She was still standing in the same spot, very still, her test paper now on the desk beside her. She was looking at him with the particular expression of a child who has learned to be careful about hoping for things. A look that expected nothing, that had built its entire survival strategy around expecting nothing, but that contained, deep underneath the armor, a fragile and terrified flicker of something else. Julian Vance, who had not crouched down for anyone in recent memory, crouched down. His bespoke trousers hit the floor of the principal's office. His gray eyes came level with her dark ones. He reached into his breast pocket and withdrew a handkerchief, white, perfectly pressed, and held it out to her. "You're not a stain," he said quietly. "Just that. Nothing else." Alara looked at the handkerchief for a long moment. Then she took it. She didn't cry. She pressed it against the corner of her eye with a precision and dignity that, in an 8-year-old, was almost unbearable to witness. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once. He stood, and somewhere in the steel architecture of Julian Vance's carefully constructed interior life, in a room he had sealed shut a very long time ago, something shifted, a bolt sliding back, a hinge groaning open, and the cold air moved. Clara Thorne arrived at St. Augustine Academy at 3:47 in the afternoon, which meant she had run most of the 2 blocks from the Harwick Street trolley stop in the rain, her apron still tied around her waist, a streak of something that was probably hollandaise sauce on her left forearm, her hair coming loose from its ponytail in wet tendrils against her neck. She burst through the front entrance of the school with the energy of someone ready to fight the entire world, which was, more or less, her default state. She was 24 years old. In different circumstances, in the circumstances that had been planned before a black ice patch on Route 9 rearranged everything 2 years ago, she would have been a junior at Barton University, studying architecture, living in a dorm room with a view of the quad. Instead, she was here, in a wet coat with a sauce-stained apron and the particular exhaustion that comes from sleeping 4.5 hours a night for 2 years straight, preparing to prostrate herself before whatever authority needed propitiating on Alara's behalf. She had heard the summary version on the phone. Alara had gotten into a fight. The principal wanted to meet. "Please come immediately. Please come immediately to Clara Mitt. Your sister might be expelled," which meant the one thing that is holding your life together is about to be removed, which meant I will do absolutely anything. She was already composing her apology in her head when she pushed open the door to what she expected to be the principal's waiting room and found, instead, a scene that stopped her completely. Alara was sitting in an armchair, a real armchair, the kind with velvet upholstery, clearly sourced from somewhere other than the functional beige furniture of the main office, beside a low table on which sat a plate of macarons in pastel colors that probably cost more individually than Clara made in an hour. Alara had a pale green one in her hand and was eating it with the careful, reverent attention of someone encountering something extraordinary, her feet still not quite reaching the floor, Julian Vance's white handkerchief tucked into her sweater pocket with the corner showing like a pocket square. Beside her, in what should have been a profoundly absurd image but somehow wasn't, sat Julian Vance. He was perched on the edge of a matching armchair at a slight angle, his posture slightly too upright for the casual setting, a cup of coffee untouched on the table beside him. He was watching Alara eat the macaron with an expression Clara couldn't immediately categorize. It was too neutral to be warmth, but it was absolutely not coldness. Alara looked up and saw her sister. Her face did something complicated. "Clara," she said carefully. Clara's eyes moved from her sister to the man beside her. She took him in the way a woman who has navigated 3 jobs and 1,000 strangers takes in a new unknown quantity, quickly, thoroughly, making an assessment. Expensive suit, expensive shoes, the particular bearing of someone who has never once in his adult life worried about paying a bill. There was something else, though, something behind the expensive surface, a quality in his face and hands that didn't quite match the polish. The face of someone who had built all of this from scratch and remembered, somewhere in the muscle memory of his body, what it had felt like before. "Who are you?" Clara said, not rudely, directly. "Julian Vance." He stood. He didn't offer his hand. Something in her stance told him she wouldn't take it. Clara turned to her sister. "Are you all right? Are you hurt?" "My shoulder is a little sore," Alara said honestly. "Preston pushed me into the lockers." Clara closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, There was a contained fury in them that she was visibly choosing not to release in a room that contained her 8-year-old sister. "Where is Sterling?" "He's been removed from the premises," Julian said. Clara looked at him again. "Removed. He was terminated. This is no longer his school." A pause. "It's mine." There was a silence in which Clara processed this information and, being Clara, immediately identified the next 10 questions she needed answered and began ranking them by priority. And Alara's scholarship is fully reinstated and, effective today, upgraded to a full comprehensive grant through university level. Tuition, fees, materials, and an annual stipend for educational expenses. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the macarons. Then she looked back at him. She had the expression of someone who is trying very hard to find the catch, because in her experience, there was always a catch, and the size of the gift was usually proportional to the size of what would be asked for in return. "Why?" she said. Julian picked up a folder from the table beside him and held it out to her. "Because she scored 100% on her mathematics exam 2 weeks before the curriculum reaches that material. Because she used an algebraic method she taught herself to solve a problem intended for 12-year-olds. And because she defended a smaller child at personal cost and didn't lie about it." He paused. "She deserves to be here. Sterling deserved to leave." Clara took the folder. She opened it. She read the document inside. She read every word of it, which Julian noted, and noted that she understood it, which he noted further. Then she closed it and set it back on the table. "Thank you for what you did for her today," she said. Her voice was steady. "I mean that." She picked up Alara's school bag from the floor beside the chair. "We'll be going now." Julian reached into his inner jacket pocket. He produced an envelope. "This is for your inconvenience. For any lost wages from leaving work early." Clara looked at the envelope. She did not take it. She looked at him. "I didn't come here for money," she said, very quietly. "I came here for my sister." She held her hand out to Alara. Alara slipped her small fingers into Clara's hand. Automatically, the way she always did, the way that had become the central axis of both their lives. She looked back at Julian as she stood. "Thank you for the macaron," Alara said gravely. "And for the handkerchief. I'll wash it and return it." "Keep it," Julian said. He stood in the vacated room for a moment after they left, the plate of macarons on the table, the envelope still in his hand. His assistant materialized in the doorway. "Sir, the contractors are waiting in the south corridor for the renovation walkthrough. Move it an hour," Julian said. He was still looking at the door through which Clara Thorne had walked out, shoulders straight, oil stain on her forearm, the hand of her small sister held firmly in hers. She deserves better than this life, he thought, which surprised him, because he had not thought that about a stranger in a very long time. The office of Julian Vance occupied the 41st floor of the Vance Holdings Tower in downtown Harwick, and it was designed, deliberately, at the instruction of the man himself, without softness. Clean lines, cold materials, a glass desk, a view of the city that on rainy days looked like a painting done in shades of charcoal and pewter, which suited him perfectly. He had grown up on those streets, not in any picturesque or romantic sense. Not in the sense the financial press liked to use when they wrote their self-made billionaire profiles, all humble beginnings and gritty determination. He had grown up on the streets of the city in the most literal sense available, in shelters when there was space, in the back of a church that left its side door unlocked, in a foster system that cycled him through 4 placements in as many years, in an institution for boys called Haverford House that the county described as a structured residential environment, and that the boys who had lived there described in ways that were not suitable for the business press. He had been 8 years old the first time a man in an expensive car had looked at him the way Sterling had looked at Alara. He had been standing outside the Haverford House gates in the rain. He had been locked out for coming back 7 minutes past curfew, in a jacket that was too thin and shoes that let in the water, and a black car had slowed at the stoplight, and the man behind the window had looked at him. Not with cruelty, exactly. With something that was almost worse, a brief, assessing glance, and then a deliberate looking away, as if Julian did not quite meet the threshold for being a real problem or a real person. He had built everything, every holding, every acquisition, every carefully calculated dismantling of every barrier that had once stood between him and a room like this one, from that moment. He had built it the way a person builds a wall, stone by stone, cold material laid on cold material, mortared with the specific determination of someone who has decided that the world will never again have the opportunity to look through him as if he weren't there. The price of the wall was that no one had been inside it in a very long time. He was thinking about all of this on the third evening after his visit to St. Augustine, sitting at his desk with a glass of scotch untouched beside his laptop and the report from his investigator open on the screen. He had asked for a background check on the Thorne sisters, not for any reason he could clearly articulate or was prepared to articulate, and the report was thorough. He read it the way he read all difficult information, straight through, without flinching. Their parents, Martin and Irene Thorne, had died 26 months ago. Black ice on Route 9, 11:40 p.m., coming home from a school concert. Alara had been in the back seat. She had walked away from the wreck with a fractured wrist and 3 cracked ribs, which had never been properly treated because the hospital had been the beginning of a medical debt that had metastasized over the following months into something that now sat at $94,000, compounded by interest that the collection agency handling it was not being gentle about. Clara had been at her university dormitory when the call came. She had been back in Harwick within 14 hours, dropped out of Barton University within a week, and had not returned to her own education since. She was currently holding 3 jobs simultaneously: mornings at a diner called Peg's on Ashworth Avenue, afternoons as a cashier at a pharmacy on Grove Street, and 3 evenings a week cleaning offices in the financial district. She earned approximately $3,200 per month before taxes, of which $1,100 went to rent, $600 to debt servicing, and most of the rest to food and Alara's various school expenses that the scholarship did not cover: field trip fees, materials, the pair of shoes that weren't falling apart that Clara had apparently saved 2 months for, and that Alara had refused to wear because the duct tape ones were the ones Dad had fixed. Julian stopped at that line and read it again. The shoes were repaired by their father approximately 3 months before his death. Subject Alara has apparently declined replacement footwear. The elder Thorne sister reports that subject stated, "He fixed them, so I'll wear them." He sat with that for a long moment. He poured the scotch and drank it. Then he read the final section of the report, which his investigator had flagged in red. As of yesterday, Principal Archibald Sterling, recently terminated from St. Augustine Academy, has made use of several contacts on the Harwick Chamber of Commerce Board to contact the employers of Clara Thorne. As of this morning, she has been let go from the Grove Street Pharmacy and from the office cleaning service. We have reason to believe that her position at the diner is also under pressure. Additionally, the landlord of the Thorne sisters' apartment at 14B, Cresswell Street, 1 Agnes Higgins, has been served with an outstanding debt notice and is reportedly using this as grounds to begin eviction proceedings, with a notice to vacate delivered this afternoon. Julian set the report down. Outside his window, the city was doing what it had been doing for 3 days, raining. The lights of Harwick blurred through the wet glass into long, watercolor streaks of amber and white, and in the pattern of them, if you were inclined towards such things, you could see the streets below as they looked at night. The narrow ones, the ones without awnings, the ones where a child could stand in the rain and discover that the world was very large and had no particular interest in whether he lived or died. He picked up his phone and called Marcus Webb, his head of legal. "I need a property acquisition," he said when Marcus answered. "Quick and clean. 14 Cresswell Street, Harwick. The whole building." A pause on the other end. "That's a residential. I know what it is. I want it done by tomorrow morning." Another pause. "And I want you to pull every favor on the Sterling situation. Whatever the prosecutor needs, they have it. I want it moving by the end of the week." He ended the call and stood at the window for a long time, watching the rain, thinking of an 8-year-old girl with duct tape shoes and her dead father's sweater, eating a pale green macaron with the focused reverence of someone who had never been given anything without first having been made to feel ashamed of wanting it. Nobody is doing that to her again, he thought. It was not a business decision. He was aware that it was not a business decision. He noted this fact and set it aside, because there would be time to examine what it meant later, and right now there were more immediate things to attend to. The eviction notice had arrived at 7 in the morning, slid under the door of apartment 14th B, while Clara was in the kitchen trying to determine whether the cough Alara had developed overnight was the kind that required a doctor or the kind that required rest and orange juice. Given that a doctor would cost $120 at the walk-in clinic, and they had $167 in the account until Friday, and the pharmacy on Grove Street had let her go 2 days ago, and she had not yet been able to find another shift anywhere in Harwick that wasn't already filled. She had read the notice. She had folded it. She had put it in the kitchen drawer where she kept important documents and closed the drawer and stood at the kitchen counter for exactly 45 seconds doing the math. And then she had gone into the small bedroom where Alara was sitting up in her bed with her school bag already packed, because Alara always packed her bag the night before, sick or well, because Clara had always said that being prepared was the one thing they could control. "I don't feel very well," Alara said, in the tone of someone reporting a mechanical problem. Clara pressed her wrist to Alara's forehead. "Fever. Not alarming, but real." She helped her back under the covers, made tea with honey from the near-empty jar, set a glass of water and the last 2 ibuprofen on the nightstand, and told her to sleep. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself, in the privacy of the moment with Alara already drifting, to press the heels of her hands against her eyes for about 30 seconds. 90 days, said the notice. That was what she'd been given. Except that it wasn't 90 days. It was a formality, a legal framework that Mrs. Higgins was using to make the process feel legitimate when what she'd actually received was a phone call from someone in Sterling's network who had implied, very clearly, that the tenancy should be ended at the earliest legal opportunity, and Mrs. Higgins, who had never found the Thorne sisters' situation anything other than an inconvenience, had been happy to comply. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, Alara's fever had climbed. Clara had been trying to call the walk-in clinic when her phone battery died. Her charger had stopped working the week before, and she hadn't replaced it. At 5:15, with Alara wrapped in a blanket and her small face flushed and unhappy, and the November rain coming down in the street below in curtains, and Mrs. Higgins having knocked twice already to ask Clara when exactly she was planning to find alternative accommodation, Clara wrapped her sister in a coat over the blanket, picked up the school bag because there was important paperwork in it, and carried her down the stairs to find a payphone or a kind stranger or some other resource she had not yet fully despaired of. She had reached the building's front stoop, the cold coming up through the cracked concrete, the rain blowing sideways under the inadequate shelter of the building's overhang, when a car stopped in front of 14 Cresswell Street. Not just a car. 3 cars, all of them black, all of them the kind that did not come to Cresswell Street under any normal set of circumstances. The middle vehicle was a Mercedes S-Class. Behind the Mercedes, a man in a dark coat who moved with the purposeful economy of someone paid to be prepared for complications. And from the Mercedes, after a brief pause, Julian Vance. He stood on the pavement in the rain, coat over his suit, hands in his pockets, and he looked at Clara and Alara on the stoop with the same expression he'd had in Sterling's office, unreadable on the surface, with something moving beneath it that he was not in the habit of naming. Clara stared at him. Alara blinked, fever-bright eyes taking him in. "You came," Alara said, with the simple certainty of a child whose faith in cause and effect was still intact. Julian looked at her. Something in his face moved, just fractionally. He crossed the pavement in 3 steps and went down on one knee, heedless of the puddle, and pressed the back of his hand to Alara's forehead with a clinical precision that was clearly an act of someone who had no reference point for doing this gently, but was attempting it anyway. "She needs a doctor," he said. "I know that," Clara said tightly. "I'm working on it. My physician is 20 minutes away." He stood. "Come." "No." Clara's voice was quiet and final. "I don't know what you want from us, Mr. Vance. I am grateful for what you did at the school, but I am not going to. I bought this building this morning," he said. "Not as a threat, as information. Mrs. Higgins is no longer your landlord. I am. And I am telling you, as your landlord, that this building will be undergoing complete renovation beginning Monday morning, and in the interim, I am offering you alternative accommodation." A pause. His jaw tightened. "This is not charity. It is a structural necessity." Clara looked at him. She was good, very good, at reading the subtext in what people said, at finding the place where a statement ended and an agenda began. She read him carefully now, the way she read everything, and she found something unexpected. A man who was not comfortable with what he was doing, who was doing it anyway, and who would be deeply, genuinely offended if she framed it as pity. "You bought the building," she repeated. Yes. You moved up the renovation timeline. The faintest pause. Yes. She looked at her sister, flushed, shivering slightly even inside her blankets, her dark eyes tracking between the two adults with the calm attentiveness of a child who has learned to wait out adult disagreements. The duct tape on her shoe glinted in the wet light. Clara had been fighting the world for 2 years. She had gotten very good at it. She had gotten so good at it that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to put something down. 1 week, she said. We'll be out of your way in 1 week while I find somewhere else. We can discuss timelines later, Julian said, and gestured to his car. Right now your sister has a fever. The physician, a Dr. Hallowell, who arrived at the penthouse apartment on Caldwell Heights as if appearing in luxury buildings at short notice or simply his ordinary Tuesday, diagnosed Alara with a respiratory infection, prescribed antibiotics, and left behind a bag of medications and a series of instructions about rest and fluids that Julian's housekeeper Mrs. Patel received with calm competence. The penthouse was, objectively, an overwhelming environment for Clara's nervous system. It occupied the entire top floor of the Caldwell building, 22 floors above the city, and it was the kind of space that had been designed by someone whose brief was apparently make it feel like living inside a concept. Floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides, the rain-blurred city glittering below. A kitchen with a counter of book-matched Italian marble. Furniture in pale linen and walnut that looked clean in the way that only things that have never accommodated actual human inconvenience can look clean. A hallway lined with an art collection that Clara, who had studied enough architecture to understand aesthetics, recognized as serious and carefully chosen. And in the middle of all of this, carried there by Clara and settled onto a sofa with approximately 7 cushions, Alara, who looked around the space with wide, fever-dimmed eyes and said, with a kind of exhausted certainty, "There are so many windows." "Yes," said Julian, who had poured a glass of water and was holding it out to her with a careful awkwardness that suggested this was not a category of activity in which he had accumulated significant experience. "Can you see the rain?" "From all of them." "Good," said Alara, and closed her eyes. "I like rain." Julian looked at the child asleep in his penthouse and then at Clara, who was standing 3 feet away watching him with the focused attention of someone cataloging potential threats. "The guest rooms are down the hall," he said. "The larger one is better for her. It's quieter. I'll sleep in the same room as her." Obviously, he turned toward the kitchen. "Have you eaten?" Clara blinked. She stopped. She genuinely could not remember. "I'm fine." Julian did not comment on this response. He simply walked into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. He was not, it turned out, a man who cooked, but he was a man who had the resources to ensure his refrigerator was impeccably stocked, and he knew how to make tea and toast, because these were the things you learned when you were a child, and toast was the meal available, and you didn't unlearn them even when you could afford anything. He made Clara tea and toast, very good toast, thick bread, real butter, and set it on the kitchen island without ceremony, and then stood at the far counter with his own coffee and looked at the city through the rain-slicked windows in a way that made it clear he was giving her space to eat without being watched. Clara ate the toast. She was so hungry that the first bite made her eyes sting. "Mr. Vance," she said. "Julian. Julian." She set the toast down. "Why are you doing this?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the rain moved across the city in slow gray curtains. "I was her age once," he said, standing in the rain. "And the people who could have done something." He stopped. He set down his coffee. "They didn't." Clara looked at him for a long time. She was a person who understood the weight of what was not said, who had learned to read the architecture of silence in a way that architecture school might have given her better words for. "This isn't charity," she said. "Not a question. Not an accusation. Just checking." "No." His gray eyes met hers. "It isn't." She nodded once. Then, she said carefully, "Thank you." By the 4th day, Alara's fever had broken. She emerged from the guest room at 7 in the morning, the handkerchief still in her pocket, wearing her father's old sweater and a pair of socks that were slightly too big for her, and padded down the hallway of the penthouse in silence. The apartment was quiet at this hour. Mrs. Patel didn't arrive until 8. Clara was still asleep, catching up on the first real sleep she'd had in months. Alara found the library. It was off the main hall, behind a door she had assumed was a closet, dark walnut paneling. Shelves on all four walls floor to ceiling, a desk with 3 monitors arranged in a precise line, a single reading lamp. She stood in the doorway and looked at it with the reverence of someone entering a sacred space. She was halfway along the second shelf, pulling out a book on geometric proofs she couldn't fully read yet, but was working on, when she saw the box. It was on the lower shelf, unremarkable, a plain cardboard box, acid-free archival type, slightly yellowed at the corners. Sitting on top of it was a single photograph in a plain wooden frame. She picked it up carefully. It was a photograph of boys, perhaps a dozen of them, ranging from 6 to 12 or so, standing in 2 uneven lines in front of a brick building. They were all in matching gray shirts that fit poorly. None of them were smiling in the way children in photographs usually smiled. They were looking at the camera with the particular expression of children who had learned to be cautious of the adults holding the camera, because attention could go either way. One of the boys in the back row was taller than the others. Dark hair, a jaw that was already becoming the jaw of the man he would be. His hands were at his sides, and he was looking not quite at the camera, but slightly past it, as if he was already somewhere else. "That's me." Alara startled. Julian was in the doorway, tie not yet done, coffee in one hand, the particular expression on his face of someone who has found that a room they thought was private has been entered, not angry, but braced. Alara looked at the photograph, then at him, then at the photograph again. "You were small," she said. "I was 8. Did you live there?" "For 2 years." She considered this with the careful seriousness she brought to all important information. Then, was it bad? He crossed the room and sat in the chair beside the desk, because standing in the doorway seemed like the wrong posture for this conversation. "Sometimes," he said. "Were you scared?" He looked at her. This small person in her dead father's sweater, who had been knocked into a row of lockers for defending someone else and had not cried about it, who ate macarons as if they were communion wafers, who carried a handkerchief in her pocket like a talisman. "Yes," he said, "I was scared a lot." Alara put the photograph back on the box very carefully, aligning it exactly as it had been. Then she stood up and walked to where he was sitting. She put her small hand on his forearm, the gesture so matter-of-fact that he had no time to prepare for it, and looked up at him. "You were scared then," she said. "But you're not now, right?" Julian looked at her hand on his arm. He had not been touched, simply, without agenda, by someone who just meant to touch him, in a very long time. He could not have said exactly how long. "Right," he said. "Good," said Alara, and removed her hand, and sat down cross-legged on the floor with the book on geometric proofs. He stayed in the chair. He did not open his laptop. He drank his coffee and read the morning briefings on his phone and occasionally looked at the top of Alara's head as she worked through problems she wasn't supposed to be able to solve for another 3 years. It was the quietest his mind had been in longer than he could remember. The routine established itself without anyone deciding on it. Alara went back to school on Thursday, delivered by Julian's driver, a development she accepted with the equanimity of someone for whom having a driver was simply a new piece of data, and returned in the afternoon with her homework completed, 2 new friends named Poppy and Sam, and a drawing she had done in art class that she presented to Julian over dinner with the gravity of someone submitting a formal document. It was a drawing of 3 people, a tall dark figure, a smaller figure with long hair, and a very small figure in the middle, standing in front of a building with a lot of windows. Julian studied it for a longer time than a drawing drawn in crayon by an 8-year-old technically required. Then he took it to his study and put it on the shelf where the photograph lived. Clara noticed. She noticed everything. The way he checked that the temperature in Alara's room was set correctly before going to bed, not announcing it, but simply passing the door with a slight pause. The way he asked Mrs. Patel, very casually, to find out what Alara's favorite foods were, and then those foods were quietly present at mealtimes. The way he had, without explanation, arranged for the debt collection agency pursuing the Thorne family medical debt to receive a full satisfaction of debt letter from his attorney, which Clara had found in her email on Wednesday morning and had come to confront him about in the kitchen. That was not an agreed-upon arrangement, she said, holding her phone out with the email on the screen. Julian was looking at his laptop and did not look up. "No, you can't just. It's been handled." He turned a page. "Julian." She put her phone on the counter. "I am not a charity case." "I'm aware." He finally looked at her. "You work 3 jobs, You haven't slept properly in 2 years, you gave up your education, and you have a $94,000 debt that was incurred before you were old enough to do anything about it. A pause. It's a structural problem. I solved it. That's what I do. The thing about Julian Vance, the thing Clara was learning with every day that passed in this apartment, was that his emotional intelligence operated entirely through action. He did not have the vocabulary for softness. He had never been given it. What he had instead was an extraordinarily precise ability to identify a problem and eliminate it. And he brought this ability to bear on the Thorne sisters situation with the same intensity he brought to a corporate acquisition, because it was, for him, exactly that serious. He had not yet found words for why. Clara had not yet found words for the feeling of standing in a kitchen making dinner while Julian sat in the doorway with a brief open in his lap and Alara's cartoon stickers arranged on his shirt pocket, quietly placed there 40 minutes ago by Alara herself, who had come downstairs in her pajamas claiming to need a glass of water and had stayed for 20 minutes to decorate him. And understanding that this impossible, cold, bewildering man was constructing something around them with the quiet ferocity of someone who has wanted a specific thing for a very long time and is only now allowing himself to believe it might be possible. She was slicing carrots. The knife hit the board in a steady rhythm. The kitchen smelled like rosemary and butter and rain through the cracked window. Julian, in the doorway, lowered the brief and just listened to the sound. He had not felt anything like peace in 34 years of living. He was fairly certain this was what it felt like. The press conference was scheduled for a Tuesday. Archibald Sterling, who had spent the 2 weeks since his termination building a story that he considered both damning and marketable, had arranged it through a publicist he paid for with money that, as Julian's forensic accountants had by then fully documented, had come from a series of disbursements from the St. Augustine Academy Endowment Fund spanning 11 years. The story Sterling intended to tell was this: that Julian Vance, a ruthless corporate raider with no background in education, had used the cover of a school acquisition to take inappropriate personal interest in 2 vulnerable minors, had removed them from their home, and was housing them in circumstances that warranted investigation by Child Protective Services. It was, as strategies go, not entirely without cunning. Sterling understood that in the court of public opinion, mud required only proximity to stick, and that even a formally dismissed allegation left a residue on a reputation. He had, over 11 years of running a school full of wealthy families, become very good at understanding what people feared losing. What he had failed to account for was Marcus Webb. Julian's head of legal had been working on the Sterling case with the methodical pleasure of a man who had spent his entire career waiting for an opponent who was, in the end, actually guilty. By the Monday before Sterling's press conference, the Harwick City Prosecutor's Office had received a package containing 11 years of endowment fund disbursements cross-referenced with Sterling's personal accounts, 3 former scholarship students' sworn statements describing systematic intimidation and financial coercion designed to force their withdrawal, documentation of 14 separate instances in which Sterling had accepted gifts from board member families in exchange for admissions decisions, and the particular piece that Marcus Webb had saved for last, a recording, sourced from the school's own security archive, of Sterling in his office 6 months prior explaining to a junior teacher that the scholarship program was a PR exercise and that the goal was to make these students' lives unpleasant enough that they leave on their own. The recording was 47 seconds long and was entirely devastating. Julian held his own press conference on the same morning as Sterling's, which he had scheduled to begin 1 hour earlier. He stood before a room of journalists in a gray suit without a prepared statement, because he had never in his life needed a prepared statement, and said, "The former principal of St. Augustine Academy has been misappropriating funds from an endowment intended for scholarship students for over a decade. This morning, that documentation was transferred to the district prosecutor. He'll be arraigned Thursday." He paused. "The school will remain operational under new management. Every scholarship student currently enrolled will have their grant extended and guaranteed for the duration of their academic career." Another pause. "That's all." A journalist raised her hand. "Mr. Vance, is it true that you've personally taken in 2 of the school's students?" "I have," he said. The room went slightly still. "The Thorne sisters are under my roof while their housing situation is resolved. That is a personal arrangement between consenting adults and has been reviewed by the appropriate oversight bodies. He looked at the journalist. Archibald Sterling attempted to use two vulnerable children as leverage against a business opponent. I would suggest that your coverage focus on that rather than on the alternative arrangements of people trying to undo the damage he caused. He left the podium. Sterling's press conference, scheduled to begin an hour later, never happened. By the time its start time arrived, his attorney had called him with news of the arraignment, and Archibald Sterling was instead spending his Tuesday in a series of conversations with increasingly expensive legal counsel, trying to identify the fastest path to a deal. The Harwich City Gazette ran the story on its front page the following morning. Former St. Augustine principal faces 14 charges. Vance establishes Thorne Vance Educational Foundation. The foundation, formally announced that same afternoon, named with both Alara's surname and Julian's, would provide full scholarships, living stipends, and family support services to children from low-income families in the Harwich public school system. Its inaugural board included Clara Thorne, listed as co-director of student welfare programming. The initial endowment was $12 million. Clara read the announcement on her phone, sitting at the kitchen island in Julian's penthouse at 8 in the morning, and then sat very still for a while. "You put my name on it," she said when Julian came in. "You've been doing the work for 2 years without resources," he said, pouring coffee with his back to her. "Now you have them. I haven't agreed to." "You can tell me no," he said. He turned around. His gray eyes were steady. "You can say no to any of it. You can take Alara back to Cresswell Street, which has been fully renovated, and go back to your 3 jobs, and I won't interfere. Everything I've set up will continue regardless." He set down the coffee. "But you're going back to university." Clara opened her mouth. "Non-negotiable," he said, with the particular authority of someone who has decided something and simply hasn't announced it yet. "Architecture, Barton University, enrolled for the spring semester. The paperwork is on your bed. You can't just enroll me in. I can, actually. I donated the building. A beat. The auditorium, specifically. It has a plaque." Clara stared at him. Then, entirely against her will, she laughed. A real laugh, startled out of her, the kind that had been in short supply for 2 years. It transformed her face completely, and Julian watched it happen with the expression of someone watching a very important thing occur. "You are the most insufferable person I have ever met," she said. "Yes," he said, without apparent concern. She looked at him across the kitchen island. He looked back. The rain, as it had been for weeks, moved against the windows. "Why?" she asked. Not about the foundation, or the university, or the apartment. The single, foundational question. He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, it was with the careful precision of a man using words in an unfamiliar way, building a sentence the way you build something you've never built before, slowly, checking the weight at each step. "Because someone should have," he said. "For both of us. A long time ago." He picked up his coffee. "And because I find I would like to now." 1 year later. Harwich City in October was raining again, which was Harwich City's default mode and had come to feel, to all 3 of them, like home weather. The particular smell of wet stone and wood smoke, the way the light at 4 in the afternoon turned the city into an amber painting, the sound of rain against the penthouse windows that Alara had declared her favorite sound in the world. She was 9 now. She had grown 2 inches, though she was still on the small side, because some things take time. She had new shoes, proper ones, blue leather with white stitching, that she had chosen herself, and her father's sweater was kept now in a box with his photograph and a few other things, taken out sometimes, but no longer worn as armor. She didn't need it as armor anymore. She had won the regional mathematics competition for her age group in March. She had cried at the award ceremony, which was the first time anyone present had seen her cry, and the crying had lasted approximately 40 seconds before she collected herself and said thank you to the judges with great dignity. Julian, in the audience, had pressed his thumb and forefinger against the bridge of his nose and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Clara had taken his other hand. She hadn't thought about it. It was a reflex, the way you reach for something solid when something overwhelming happens. His hand had closed around hers, and neither of them had mentioned it, and they had not stopped. And now it was October, and this had become simply a thing that was true about their lives. Clara was in her 2nd year at Barton University. She had, as it turned out, not lost any of the aptitude she'd had before, only the time and resources to apply it. She was studying architecture with a focus on community housing design, which her professors described as a significant and necessary field, and which she described as what you do when you've lived in buildings that were built by people who had no idea what it's like to actually live in them. She was good at it. She was going to be exceptional. On a Saturday in October, the three of them were in the penthouse in the late afternoon. Alara at the table with a mathematics textbook and a notebook already half full of proofs. Clara on the sofa with her drafting pencil and her studio project. Julian on the far side of the room with his laptop and the very specific stillness of a man who has learned, over the past year, that being in a room with two other people in comfortable silence is not a loss of anything. At some point, she could not have said exactly when, the sound of cutting vegetables had been joined by a voice that was Clara's, talking Alara through a recipe in the kitchen, and Julian had put down his laptop and stood in the doorway to listen without either of them noticing. This was how he had spent a year learning what warmth felt like from the outside in, standing in doorways, listening to the rhythms of a household that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with love and effort and the specific texture of two people who had kept each other alive through sheer will, who now had, for the first time, enough. He had been thinking about the ring for 3 months. It was in his jacket pocket now, not ostentatious, because Clara would not want ostentatious, but real and considered and made by a jeweler who had spent several bewildered meetings with Julian trying to understand what, exactly, the man wanted before landing on. Something that looks like it belongs to someone who wouldn't take it off. Alara appeared in the kitchen doorway. She looked at him, then at the ring box he had, somewhat absent-mindedly, taken out of his pocket. Her dark eyes went wide. She covered her mouth with both hands. Julian looked at her. Then, for the second time in their acquaintance, he crouched down to her level. He opened the box. "I wanted to ask you first," he said. Alara looked at the ring for a very long time. Then she looked at him with those eyes that had looked at him in Sterling's office a year ago. The eyes that expected nothing, that had been trained by life to protect themselves from hope. But there was no protection in them now. There was only the thing underneath. "Yes," she said. 1,000 yes. From the kitchen, Clara's voice. "Alara, can you bring me the rosemary? It's on the..." She appeared in the kitchen doorway and stopped. She looked at Julian, crouched on the floor with the ring box in his hand. She looked at Alara, vibrating with barely contained emotion beside him. She put her hand against the doorframe. "What's happening?" she said, in a voice that was trying very hard to be her usual voice and wasn't quite managing it. Julian stood. He crossed the kitchen. He stood in front of her and opened the ring box between them, and he looked at her with the gray eyes that had been cold the first time she saw them, and were not cold now, had not been cold, she realized, for longer than she could pinpoint. And he said, in the low voice that had first struck her as dangerous, and that she now knew was only the voice of someone who had never been safe enough to speak at full volume, "Clara Thorne, you fought the entire world for your sister, and you never stopped being yourself in the middle of it. You walked into a room full of things you could have wanted, and you asked me what I wanted in return, because that's how you think." He paused. He was not a man who gave speeches, and the effort was visible and utterly disarming. "I want to be the thing that fights the world for you. For both of you." Another pause. "If you'll let me." The rain moved against the windows of the Caldwell building, 41 floors above Harwick City. Clara Thorne, who had not cried in front of another person since the night her parents died, and who had been angry about that for 2 years, and who was still, fundamentally, the woman who had walked out of Sterling's office with her sister's hand in hers and nothing in her other hand. That woman looked at the ring and looked at this man and looked at her sister, who was standing in the kitchen doorway pressing her face into a dish towel to muffle a sound that was half laugh and half sob. She took the ring from the box. "You could have just asked," she said. "I could have," he agreed. She put the ring on herself, because she was Clara, and then she put her hands on either side of his face and kissed him, and behind them Alara produced a sound of pure and unfettered joy that echoed around the penthouse and out through the rain-soaked windows and into the city below. There is a particular kind of person who is made by loss, who is carved by it into something harder and more defined than they would have been otherwise, who carries their damage as both wound and weapon, who has learned so well to survive alone that the idea of not being alone has stopped seeming real. The three of them had been that kind of person, A small girl who wore her grief in the shape of a faded sweater and a pair of duct-taped shoes, who refused to be shamed and refused to stop being kind, and who had cracked open the vault of a man's heart with the simple, devastating logic of a child who understood what fear looked like because she had been living with it too. A young woman who had put herself between the world and everything she loved and stood there without flinching for 2 years, who had so much to give and had been given so little in return, and who had to learn, slowly, stubbornly, on her own terms, that receiving was not the same as surrendering. A man who had built his fortress stone by stone from the ruins of a childhood that had taught him the world was cold, and people were unreliable, and the only safe thing was to need no one, who had walked into a school in the rain and heard a small girl say being poor isn't a crime, but being cruel is, and felt something in his chest give way like ice in April. They had found each other at the exact intersection of all their damage. And from that intersection, they had built, not without difficulty, not without the long and patient work of learning how to trust and be trusted, how to stay when everything in your body is telling you to go, something that none of them had believed, in their private and unexamined hearts, they would ever actually have. They called it simply home. Outside, the rain continued. The city moved in its amber light. Somewhere in Harwick, a 12-year-old girl on scholarship at St. Augustine Academy worked through her homework at a kitchen table that had heat, in shoes that didn't need tape, because a foundation in someone else's name had made sure she could. And somewhere across the city, in a building that was drafty and too expensive and full of love, 3 people ate dinner together in the rain sound of their 41st floor window, and nobody had to be anywhere else. For the first time in all their separate, difficult lives, they were exactly where they belonged.